Margaret Montgomery's lucky calculator sat beside her morning coffee like a talisman against chaos. 23 years of IRS audits had taught her that every number told a story, and this Tuesday morning in Minneapolis, the numbers were screaming. The Kryllian announcement came at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in October, broadcast simultaneously on every screen on Earth. Margaret was reviewing a particularly creative tax evasion when her monitor flickered to display an 8-foot alien with compound eyes like broken mirrors. Citizens of Earth, your planet has been acquired by the Kryllian Administrative Collective. You have 90 days to achieve full regulatory compliance. Failure will result in productivity relocation. Supreme Administrator Vex Prime stood before what looked like the universe's most terrifying DMV office. Behind him floated a document that made Margaret's auditor's soul ache. Form 47, Alpha, Tertiary, Request for Planetary Compliance Assessment. Even at a glance, she could see the telltale signs of bureaucratic incompetence. Mismatched reference numbers, circular dependencies, section headings that referenced non-existent subsections. After 23 years of finding mistakes, Margaret had just found the biggest fraud in the galaxy. Week 1. Assessment. Margaret approached the alien forms like a crime scene. Her red pens were arranged by ink saturation, darkest to lightest, ammunition sorted for maximum effectiveness. The small American flag paperweight caught fluorescent light, and beneath it lay printouts of every Kryllian form she could access. She'd been at this for 16 hours straight, fueled by coffee strong enough to dissolve tax liens and the righteous anger that had powered her through 2 decades of fighting for taxpayers. If I didn't know better, she muttered, circling another regulatory recursion, I'd say someone designed this system to fail everyone except the people running it. The patterns were clear. Form 47 Alpha Tertiary contained 3 different entity numbers for the same organization. The conquest date predated the form's existence by 6 months. And in Section 12 BC, buried in subclauses that would make a tax attorney weep, was a definition of sentient status. So carelessly written, it accidentally excluded every non-Kryllian species from legal existence. Her phone buzzed. Her daughter's voice came through, distorted by subspace transmission but fear crystal clear. Mum, the productivity centers aren't training facilities, they're labor camps. Families separated, children reclassified based on paperwork they can't read. Margaret stared at the forms spread across her desk like battle plans. Behind every form was a human story. But these forms were writing stories of systematic genocide, one impossible requirement at a time. How long do we have? 83 days. But Mum, they're not waiting for the deadline. Margaret closed her eyes. Time to fight the biggest system of all. The Loring Park Community Center hadn't hosted a gathering this important since the Vietnam protests. Margaret had chosen it careful public enough to avoid suspicion, private enough for the kind of conversation that could get them spaced. Bob Kowalski arrived first. Because Marines were always early and 30 years of DMV work hadn't changed his priorities. Dr. Sarah Kim came next, legal files clutched like armor. She'd lost her first practice when corporate lawyers buried her clients in paperwork until they surrendered. Frank Martinez was last, his briefcase surviving 40 years of Social Security service. These alien forms aren't designed to help anyone, Frank said, his voice carrying 4 decades of translating government gibberish into help for people who needed it. They're designed to process people like inventory. Margaret pulled up her analysis on a borrowed laptop. The organizational nightmare looked like a circulatory system designed by someone having a breakdown. 17 levels of oversight, each requiring approval from 3 departments that require approval from the first department. Every form references 3 others. Every regulation contradicts 2 more. Bob studied the chart with a tactician's eye. This isn't administration. It's a self-licking ice cream cone. Gets worse, Sarah added. According to Section 12, BC, sentient status requires Kryllian neural architecture, which means they don't legally recognize us as intelligent life. Margaret felt pieces clicking into place with the logic of a balanced ledger. They're not evil, they're trapped. Their civilization has become a bureaucratic machine that can't stop consuming worlds because stopping would mean acknowledging the system doesn't work. So how do we stop it? Margaret's smile held 23 years of catching tax cheats. We give them perfect bureaucratic compliance. Margaret's apartment became a war room. Every surface covered with organizational charts mapping oppression across 17 star systems. But it was the human cost that kept her working 18-hour days. Footage of families destroyed by incomprehensible classifications. Children torn from parents by forms they couldn't read. The breakthrough came when Professor Elena Vasquez joined them. A linguistics expert who specialized in governmental communication theory, she took one look at their research and laughed with recognition. This system isn't designed to work. It's designed to fail in ways that benefit administrators. She pulled up a document that hurt to look at. Form 445, Gamma requires verification from Form 891 Delta, which can only be obtained after completing Form 445 Gamma. Perfect bureaucratic Ouroboros. But systems like that collapse? Frank pointed out. That's the beauty. Every time it starts collapsing, they conquer another world to add complexity and reset the cycle. Elena's smile was sharp as glass. New planets provide new challenges, which justify more administrators, which require more complexity, which eventually require more conquests. Margaret felt pattern recognition kick in the moment when numbers finally told their story. Show me the precedents. What Elena found in Kryllian legal archives changed everything. The hegemony wars, 6 centuries ago. The empire had nearly collapsed when bureaucratic complexity grew so extreme that entire star systems were lost because the paperwork was too complex to process. More importantly, the archives contained forgotten legal precedents. Section 847 Theta, Elena read, voice shaking. Territorial Acquisition Reversal Protocol. Any entity demonstrating superior bureaucratic competency can file for ownership transfer if they can prove the original acquisition was improperly documented. Bob whistled. They wrote a law letting someone take over their empire if they could prove the Kryllians filed their paperwork wrong. Margaret stared at centuries of legal precedents scrolling past. Every regulation designed to solve problems created by previous regulations. Every law intended to clarify confusion caused by earlier laws. A civilization strangling itself with red tape. Time to file some paperwork. The first obstacle was accessing the complete legal database. Military-grade encryption designed to keep conquered species from understanding the laws governing their subjugation. That's when they discovered they weren't alone. Dr. Jennifer Walsh contacted them through encrypted channels. Former NSA cryptographer, xenolinguistics professor. Part of an underground network of human bureaucrats scattered across occupied worlds. Tax attorneys on Proxima, customs officials on Wolf 359, even a postal inspector on Kepler Station. Jennifer explained, "The Kryllians think we're harmless because we work with paperwork instead of weapons." The second obstacle was personal. Margaret arrived at work to find her desk surrounded by caution tape, her files copied, her lucky calculator confiscated as potentially disruptive technology. Commander Zethak examined her textbooks with focused attention. Your productivity metrics show irregularities. Excessive time spent on theoretical compliance scenarios. Just ensuring accuracy, Commander. Wouldn't want filing errors. Your species' obsession with procedural correctness is noted. However, excessive focus suggests potential administrative inefficiency. It was a threat disguised as evaluation. Margaret had seen the same tactics from corrupt supervisors silencing whistleblowers. That afternoon came the real blow. Frank's call at 4:47 p.m. They took Emma, said her medical forms didn't meet accessibility standards, reclassified her from dependent family member to special administrative case. Emma was Frank's 12-year-old granddaughter with cerebral palsy, who taught him that good bureaucracy saved lives, while bad bureaucracy destroyed them. Margaret stared at alien paperwork covering her walls and felt impossible weight. Every move triggered worse retaliation. Every challenge resulted in more destroyed families. Bob found her at 2 am, staring at Emma's picture. a smiling girl in a wheelchair who'd once said, "Forms should help people, not hurt them." "Ma'am," Bob said quietly, settling with coffee strong enough to dissolve leans. "The bad systems count on good people being too afraid to fight back. They count on us being so worried about making things worse that we let them make things terrible." Margaret felt something crystallize, not hope, but professional determination. The feeling that had carried her through 23 years of fighting institutional indifference. Then, we better win. Form 1247 Omega Supreme took 72 hours to construct. 847 pages cross, referencing 47, 0 regulatory violations in Kryllian conquest documentation, supported by 35, 0 pages of precedential analysis. But the artistry wasn't in individual violations. It was how they interlocked, creating cascade failures that would force the system to confront its own contradictions. Every citation verified through their own precedents, Sarah reported. Every cross-reference validated by their courts. Every argument using their logic turned against itself. Filing required perfect coordination across multiple jurisdictions. The underground network proved crucial. Tax attorneys on 17 worlds, customs officials in 12 systems, postal inspectors who understood interstellar mail regulations. The deadline was 5 p.m. Galactic Standard Time. Margaret had 43 minutes. She sat at her desk, the same desk where she'd spent 23 years fighting smaller battles, and stared at the submit button. Around her, the Minneapolis IRS field office buzzed with energy of government workers who'd discovered their expertise was the galaxy's most powerful weapon. Then the power went out. "Emergency generators online," Frank called. "But network connection is down." Margaret grabbed her handwritten master copy and ran. Her team scattered across the city like a tactical unit, each carrying pieces of humanity's salvation. At Sarah's law office, backup generators hummed with reliability of systems designed by people who understood failure wasn't an option. Margaret's fingers flew across keyboards, while her team coordinated across the galaxy. 7 minutes left. Margaret's master filing uploaded with 3 minutes, 17 seconds remaining. Form 1247, Omega Supreme received. Processing time, 72 hours maximum. After months of fighting an empire with paperwork, all they could do was wait. The response came as a procession. 12 Kryllian judges filed into the Minneapolis IRS office, ceremonial robes dragging on industrial carpet, compound eyes reflecting fluorescent lights, with something that might have been professional admiration. The Chief Justice approached Margaret's desk, and his translator crackled with formal precision. "Human Montgomery, by authority vested in us by Galactic Regulatory Code Section 847 Theta, we transfer all territorial holdings, administrative authorities, and regulatory jurisdictions of the Kryllian Administrative Collective to your custody, effective immediately." He paused, studying Margaret with recognition of a master craftsman. "The paperwork is impeccable. Where did you learn to exploit our legal system with such precision?" Margaret straightened her papers with careful precision, looked up at the Chief Justice of what used to be a galactic empire, and smiled. 23 years with the Internal Revenue Service, Your Honor. We wrote the book on making complex systems work for people instead of against them. What are your administrative intentions? Margaret considered carefully. It was fair his civilization had just been conquered by a tax auditor from Minneapolis. First, comprehensive efficiency audit of your governmental structure. Eliminate unnecessary complexity. Streamline regulatory frameworks so they serve citizens instead of bureaucrats who govern them. She tapped her calculator, a gesture natural as breathing. Then proper oversight protocols. The kind that makes bureaucracy work for people instead of processing them like inventory. Our administrative class? Margaret's smile widened with satisfaction. She pulled out a document representing not just months of work, but a lifetime of believing government could help instead of hurt. You'll still have jobs. Someone needs to implement the new forms. She held up Form AA1, Administrative Procedures that actually work for citizens. The Chief Justice accepted it with trembling limbs, scanning with focused attention of someone encountering revolution. Margaret watched his posture shift, as he realized what he held: regulatory framework designed to help rather than hinder, clarify rather than confuse, serve rather than subjugate. This form explains itself as you read it, he said, translator struggling with concepts like user-friendly design. Instructions are comprehensive but comprehensible, requirements reasonable and achievable, and the process is humane. Revolutionary concept, Margaret agreed, feeling deep satisfaction of making complex systems work for ordinary people. We'll start with basic reform on your homeworld and work outward. Conservative estimate: your entire empire running efficiently within 2 years. As judges filed out clutching AA, one like sacred texts, Margaret turned to her computer. Her inbox showed 47 new messages from every world in what was now the Margaret Montgomery Administrative Efficiency Zone. The first message was from her daughter aboard medical ship Compassion. "Mom, don't know what you did, but Kryllian administrators released every human from labor camps and asked us to help redesign healthcare forms. They said someone named Montgomery showed them the beauty of functional bureaucracy. Former prisoners crying with relief. Kryllian clerks crying because they finally understand what their jobs were for. Emma is safe and coming home. Love, Sarah." Margaret smiled, cracked her knuckles, and reached for her coffee mug, the same mug she'd used for 23 years of smaller battles. The coffee was cold, but the work was just beginning. 6 months later, the Kryllian homeworld hosted its first annual efficiency festival, a celebration of streamlined government that actually worked. Margaret stood on the reviewing platform, watching parades of former bureaucrats who'd learned that helping people was more satisfying than processing them. Former Supreme Administrator Vex Prime approached with what might have been a smile. "Administrator Montgomery, quarterly reports show unprecedented satisfaction ratings across 17 worlds. Service requests processed in hours instead of months. Appeal procedures citizens can understand and use. How are your people adapting?" "Better than hoped. Most entered government service wanting to help communities. When the system was too complex to help anyone, they became frustrated and bitter. Now they remember why they chose public service." Margaret looked around the command center that once orchestrated oppression of 17 worlds and now coordinated the largest administrative reform in Galactic history. Through windows, she could see the city grown around the new capital, humans and Kryllians working together, designing systems, serving citizens instead of processing them. Her computer chimed with a message from Jennifer Walsh. "Margaret, University of Proxima established the Montgomery Institute for Practical Bureaucracy. First graduating class of 400 starts next month. The revolution is spreading." Margaret smiled and began typing the same kind of professional communication she'd written for 23 years, but with stakes spanning the galaxy. "Excellent news. Remember, every regulation should serve citizens, every form should be understandable, and every bureaucrat should remember their job is to help people, not process them." She leaned back, looking out at the city, proving bureaucracy could be a force for good when designed by people who understood systems existed to serve citizens. Somewhere in the outer rim, other bureaucratic empires were probably preparing their most complex procedures, confident their superiority would overwhelm any challenge from a species that had only recently discovered interstellar travel. Margaret Montgomery was about to teach them the same lesson she'd taught the Kryllians. There was no such thing as a perfect bureaucratic system, only systems that hadn't met someone who understood them well enough to make them work better. After 23 years of government service, Margaret had gotten very good at making systems work for people instead of against them. Margaret picked up her red pen, arranged her papers with professional precision, and got back to work. Because someone had to audit the universe, and she'd just proven she was the best person for the job.